Jonathan Whitmore grabbed the envelope off his desk and ripped it open with one hand, his other hand still resting on Victoria's waist. He didn't even stop laughing, but the laugh died the second his eyes hit the first page. His face went white, then red. He swept the champagne glasses off the desk with one violent motion glass exploding across the marble floor and hurled the papers at the wall. "She wouldn't dare!" he snarled. Victoria flinched backward. And in that moment, in that office, high above Chicago, the most powerful man in the room finally understood one devastating truth. His pregnant wife had been 10 steps ahead of him the entire time. If the person who deserves justice finally getting it moves you, subscribe right now, drop your city in the comments, and don't you dare leave before this story is finished. Jonathan Whitmore had a talent that most people never recognized, not at first anyway. It wasn't intelligence. It wasn't business instinct. It wasn't even charm, though he had plenty of that in the early days. The kind of warm, disarming charm that makes you feel like the most important person in the room. No. Jonathan's real talent was this: he knew exactly how to make someone feel indispensable right up until the moment he no longer needed them. And he had used that talent on the one person who should have been the last person he ever turned it against: his wife. The Tuesday morning, everything began to unravel, started like every other Tuesday in Jonathan Whitmore's Chicago world. His 42nd floor office overlooked the lake, the windows so clean and wide that on clear days you could see all the way to the horizon, and Jonathan liked that. He liked seeing far. He liked feeling like a man who could see everything coming. He had no idea what was already here. His assistant, a young man named Derek, who had worked for him for 3 years and had learned early on never to speak unless spoken to, brought the morning mail at precisely 9:15. There was a stack of the usual things: investment proposals, city council correspondence, a letter from a contractor in Milwaukee, and then at the bottom a plain white envelope, no return address, just his name, Jonathan Whitmore, personal and confidential. He barely glanced at it. He was in the middle of telling Victoria something funny, something that had happened at dinner the night before with a city alderman, and Victoria was laughing the way she always laughed when he told stories, with her head tilted back just slightly, her hand resting on his arm. She was beautiful in the way that expensive things are beautiful, polished, deliberate, without a single imperfection that hadn't been carefully managed. "What's that?" Victoria asked, nodding at the envelope as Jonathan finally picked it up. "Don't know," he said, and he was still half smiling from the story. "Probably some nonsense." He tore it open. He pulled out the papers, and the smile stayed on his face for exactly 4 more seconds, because it took him 4 seconds to process what he was actually looking at. His brain had been so completely unprepared for this possibility that it genuinely struggled to interpret the information his eyes were sending it. It was like trying to read a language you've been told doesn't exist. Divorce papers, from Claire. Not just any divorce papers. 3 inches thick, tabbed, organized with the kind of meticulous precision that Jonathan recognized immediately because he had watched Claire organize things with that same precision for 6 years. Every tab had a number. Every numbered section had a header. And behind the headers were documents, pages and pages of documents that Jonathan had never in his most paranoid moments imagined she could have accessed. Bank records, wire transfer logs, corporate account statements dated back 4 years, copies of signatures, his signature, her signature, and handwritten notes in Claire's neat, careful script that annotated every single page. Jonathan's hand tightened on the papers. "Jonathan," Victoria said. He didn't answer her. He flipped to another section, then another. His breathing had changed. It was coming faster now, shallower, and somewhere in the back of his mind he registered that his face was probably doing something he didn't want it to do in front of Victoria, but he couldn't stop it. He couldn't control it, because what he was looking at was not possible. It was not possible because Claire was 7 months pregnant. Claire was exhausted and emotional and financially dependent on him in ways he had very carefully and very methodically arranged. Claire was supposed to be at home putting together furniture for the nursery, not this. Not this. "Baby," Victoria said, her voice shifting. "You're scaring me. What is it?" Jonathan set the papers down on his desk. He looked at them for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone and called his attorney. "Richard," he said, and his voice came out steady, which surprised even him. "I need you in my office, right now. And Richard," he paused, his jaw tightening, "bring your whole team." What Jonathan Whitmore did not know yet, what he couldn't have known as he stood there gripping his phone, was that those divorce papers had been 3 months in the making. 3 months of Claire Bennett Whitmore sitting in the spare bedroom she had quietly converted into her workspace, working in the hours after Jonathan thought she was asleep, organizing evidence with the same focused, unhurried intelligence she had once used to save his company from collapse. 3 months of a woman who had been underestimated her entire marriage, finally deciding that being underestimated was in fact her greatest advantage. To understand why Claire did what she did, and how you have to understand who she was before Jonathan decided she was nobody. Claire Bennett had grown up in Evanston, the daughter of a high school math teacher and an accountant. Numbers were the language of her childhood. Her father used to say that numbers never lied. People lied, systems lied, but the numbers themselves were always telling you the truth. You just had to know how to listen. Claire had grown up listening. By the time she was 26 and working as a senior financial analyst at a mid-sized consulting firm, she could read a balance sheet the way other people read a novel, flipping through it, quickly picking up the story, sensing the tension before she could fully explain why. That was how she found the problem at Whitmore Construction. The firm had hired her consulting company to do a routine audit. Claire was assigned to the account almost randomly. She was the only one in the office who didn't have a full caseload that week. She went through the files expecting 3 days of boring work and a clean report. Instead, she found a disaster. The accounting was a mess. Not fraudulent, just catastrophically disorganized. Expenses had been miscategorized for 2 years. Tax filings were built on incorrect figures, and there were 2 outstanding loans that the company's owner apparently didn't know were about to default because no one had been tracking the repayment schedule correctly. The whole thing was like watching someone walk confidently toward a cliff edge in the fog. She stayed late 2 nights fixing the filing errors, caught the loan defaults before they triggered, and renegotiated the repayment terms directly with the lender by presenting corrected financials that made the company look far healthier than its books had suggested. And then she met Jonathan. He had come in on the 3rd day expecting to be told he was bankrupt. Instead, Claire handed him a clean report and explained clearly and without drama exactly what she had found and what she had done about it. Jonathan stared at her. He said, "You did all of this in 3 days." She said, "The loan officer was flexible once he saw the corrected numbers. You were in better shape than your record suggested." He said, "How do I thank you?" She said, "Pay your consulting invoice on time." He laughed. It was a real laugh, surprised, unguarded, and Claire noticed it because it was nothing like the performance she had watched him give in the meeting room that morning when he thought he was about to hear bad news. That laugh was genuine. For a moment he was just a man who had been terrified, and then unexpectedly saved, and his relief was honest. She thought, this is a man who knows how to feel things. She was right about that. What she didn't know yet was that he also knew how to stop feeling them whenever it was convenient. They had dinner that night, just to talk about the business recovery plan, Jonathan said, and that was probably true at first. But dinner turned into 2 hours, and 2 hours turned into a walk by the lake, and Claire found herself talking about her father's notebooks full of financial theories, and Jonathan talked about growing up watching his family lose their home and swearing he would never let that happen to himself. And something between them clicked into place in the quiet way that things sometimes do, not explosively, not like a movie, just a door opening in a house you didn't know you were looking for. 6 months later, they were engaged. A year after that, they were married. And from the very beginning, Claire was the one holding everything together. She didn't mind it at first. She was good at it, and she loved him. And there was something genuinely satisfying about watching the company grow, knowing that her systems were what made the growth sustainable. She built the financial infrastructure from scratch, the reporting structures, the internal audit processes, the vendor payment systems that prevented the cash flow crises that had nearly killed the company before she found it. She reviewed every major contract before Jonathan signed it. She caught 3 deals early on that would have turned into catastrophic losses and steered Jonathan away from them without making him feel embarrassed about the near misses. She made him look brilliant. And he was smart enough in those early years to say so. He gave her credit. He introduced her at events as his partner. He told the story of how she had saved his company before he even knew it needed saving. People would look at Claire and then look at Jonathan, and you could see them recalibrating, understanding that behind this energetic, magnetic man was a woman who knew things he didn't. Claire liked those moments. Not because she needed the recognition. She had never been someone who needed her name on things to feel satisfied. but because it meant Jonathan saw her, really saw her. And being seen by the person you love is one of the most important things in the world. The problem was being seen can become inconvenient for certain kinds of men as they grow more powerful. Jonathan's first investment deal closed when they had been married 2 years. It was a commercial real estate project on the north side of Chicago, and Claire had spent 4 months analyzing it, restructuring the financing 3 times, and negotiating with 2 different banks before the numbers worked. The closing dinner was attended by investors, lawyers, and city officials. Jonathan gave a speech. He thanked the investors. He thanked his legal team. He thanked his construction crews. He did not mention Claire. She thought it was an oversight. She told herself it was an oversight. When she brought it up gently on the drive home, Jonathan said, "Baby, everyone knows how important you are. I don't need to announce it." She accepted that. She told herself that was enough. She believed him. But it happened again and again. And each time the explanation was slightly different, but the result was the same. Claire was behind the scenes, Jonathan was in the lights, and the distance between those 2 positions was growing, without either of them saying anything direct about it. The second deal was bigger. Then came the third. Then a development project that required city permits and political relationships and a kind of aggressive social navigation that Jonathan was naturally gifted at. The company wasn't just surviving anymore, it was becoming something real, something that got written about in Chicago business magazines, something with a name that people recognized at Chamber of Commerce events. And somewhere during that transformation, Jonathan started making small, quiet changes to the structure of their arrangement that Claire only fully understood in retrospect. Her access to the main company accounts became read-only. There was a reason given something about separating personal and business finances clearly for tax purposes. Claire accepted it because the explanation was plausible. Her name was removed from 2 subsidiary company registrations. The reason given was a restructuring of the corporate entities. Claire noticed it but didn't push back because Jonathan seemed stressed about the deal he was working on, and she didn't want to add to it. She was moved off the internal email chains for major contracts. The reason given was that she was spending too much time on company business when she should be focusing on herself. Jonathan said it with such warmth, such apparent concern for her that she almost felt grateful. Almost. There was a part of Claire quiet, watchful her father's daughter, that had been taking note of these changes, even as the rest of her kept telling herself they were innocent. That part of her had started keeping a separate file. Nothing dramatic, just dates and descriptions, just a woman writing things down because her father had taught her that numbers never lie, and neither do documented facts, and something in her gut was telling her she might need to know exactly what she had seen and when she had seen it. She called that file her worry file. She never showed it to Jonathan. By the time she got pregnant, which Jonathan had pushed for, had wanted enthusiastically, had celebrated with champagne and phone calls to everyone they knew. The worry file had 12 months of entries. And then the pregnancy changed things again, not in the way it should have. Jonathan became attentive in the early weeks, almost aggressively attentive, the way a man acts when he wants his attentiveness noted. He was present at the first appointment. He was present at the ultrasound where they heard the heartbeat. He told the story of that heartbeat at 3 different dinner parties, and each time he told it, his hand would find Claire's, and she would feel the warmth of his fingers and think, "He loves me. He loves us. Whatever the worry file says, this is real." But he wasn't at the appointment after that, or the one after that. In the 3rd month of her pregnancy, Claire came home from a checkup to find the house empty and a text from Jonathan saying he had a late meeting. She ate dinner alone at their kitchen table. She put her hand on her stomach. She felt the baby move for what she thought might be the first time, just a flutter so faint. She wasn't sure it was real, and she wanted to tell someone, and the person she wanted to tell was her husband, and her husband was at a meeting. She called him. It rang 4 times. He didn't answer. She put the phone down, sat in the quiet kitchen, and opened her laptop. She was not looking for anything specific. She was not in that moment consciously suspicious. She was just a woman with too much time and a brain that had never learned how to be idle, opening the household financial management system out of something between habit and need for distraction. And she saw a charge she didn't recognize. It was small. A restaurant. A place she didn't know in River North. $280 on a Tuesday night. 2 weeks earlier on a credit card she technically had access to view, even though Jonathan had quietly moved to managing it himself 8 months ago. She looked at the date. She checked her calendar. That was the night Jonathan had told her he was in Milwaukee for a site meeting. She didn't say anything. She didn't call the restaurant or do anything dramatic or confrontational. She just sat at the kitchen table and let herself feel the things she had been not feeling for a very long time. She already knew. She just needed to decide what to do with knowing. The answer when it came to her was so completely consistent with who she had always been that it almost made her laugh. She was going to do what she always did. She was going to look at the numbers. And she was going to document everything. The next morning, Claire called her sister Amy, who was her closest friend and the only person in the world she fully trusted. Amy drove in from Oak Park with coffee and a box of pastries, and she sat across from Claire at the kitchen table, and Claire laid out everything she had been not saying for months: the access restrictions, the missing introductions, the account changes, the restaurant charge, the appointments Jonathan hadn't come to. Amy was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Claire, how long have you known?" And Claire said, "I've been not knowing for about a year. I think I've actually known since the kitchen table last night." Amy reached across the table and took her hand. "What do you want to do?" Claire looked out the window for a moment. Then she looked back at her sister. "I want to be careful," she said. "I don't want to move fast and get this wrong. I want to know exactly what I'm dealing with, and I want to know my legal rights, and I want to have everything documented before I do anything." "Should you call a lawyer?" "Not yet," Claire said. "Not until I know what there is to find." What she found in the weeks that followed was worse than she had imagined. Not the affair that was painful, but she had already prepared herself for it. What was worse was the rest of it. 3 weeks after the kitchen table night, while Jonathan was at a dinner function and had left his home office unlocked, a rare oversight, Claire spent 2 hours going through files she had technically been excluded from for over a year. She photographed everything that looked relevant. She sent the photos to a new email account she had created on a phone she had purchased with cash 2 weeks earlier, using Amy's address for the account registration. She found loan guarantees, 3 separate personal guarantees on company loans, totaling almost $8 million guarantees bearing her signature. She did not remember signing them. She looked at the signatures very carefully. She did not recognize her own handwriting. She sat on the floor of her husband's home office for a full minute just breathing. Because this wasn't just an affair. This wasn't just a man who had been hiding his personal life. This was fraud. Someone had forged her name on financial documents that made her personally liable for millions of dollars of company debt that could, if the deals went wrong, follow her out of the marriage and into a courtroom. And she knew with a certainty that settled into her bones like cold water that this had been intentional. This had been a safety net. If the company collapsed, if something went wrong, Jonathan's plan was to have her signature on enough paper that the legal and financial chaos would neutralize her completely. A pregnant woman fighting fraud charges couldn't fight a custody battle. A woman drowning in litigation couldn't run to the press. A woman who appeared complicit in financial misconduct couldn't credibly challenge anything Jonathan chose to say about her. She was supposed to be trapped. She called Rachel Morgan the next morning. Rachel Morgan was a family and corporate attorney with a reputation in Chicago's legal community that intimidated even other lawyers. She had spent 20 years doing exactly 2 kinds of cases, family law and corporate fraud, and she was one of the few people in the city whose practice touched both, which made her uniquely positioned to understand the intersection of what Claire was describing. They met at Rachel's office downtown. Claire brought the phone with the photographs. She brought her personal records. She brought a copy of the original company partnership documentation from 6 years ago, which she had kept in her own files, not Jonathan's files, because she had never been someone who let important documents live in only one place. Rachel looked at everything. Then she looked at Claire. "You understand," Rachel said carefully, "that what you're describing, if the signatures are forged, is a serious crime, not a civil matter, a criminal matter." "I understand," Claire said. "And you understand that when this comes out, and it will come out if we move forward, your husband will react. He has resources. He will retain aggressive counsel. He will attempt to control the narrative." "I know," Claire said. "What's your goal?" Rachel asked. "What do you actually want out of this?" Claire was quiet for a moment. "I want out," she said. "I want the marriage legally ended on terms that protect me and my daughter. I want my name cleared of any liability for documents I didn't sign. And I want to make sure he cannot use the custody process as a weapon against me." That last part, Rachel said, is the most important and the most complex. I know, Claire said again. That's why I'm here now, before the baby comes. Because I need to have everything ready before she's born, because once she's here, he'll have a new piece to move on the board. Rachel leaned back in her chair. She said, Mrs. Whitmore, I think we should talk about what an exceptionally thorough client you would be. And Claire, for the first time in a very long time, allowed herself a small smile. Because that was exactly what she intended to be. For 3 months, Claire did the hardest thing she had ever done. She pretended. She went to the dinners Jonathan asked her to attend. She stood beside him at the charity event in November, where he was recognized for philanthropic contributions to the city, and she held his hand on the stage, and she smiled at the right moments, and afterward he kissed her cheek and said, You're always so good at these things. And she said, Thank you, sweetheart, and felt absolutely nothing except a distant crystalline clarity. She talked to Rachel twice a week, always from the second phone, always from Amy's house or a coffee shop across town. The financial investigation was moving carefully but steadily. Rachel had brought in a forensic accountant, a woman named Karen Yu, who had previously worked for the FBI, and Karen had started finding things that even Claire hadn't uncovered yet, the consulting accounts. 4 of them buried in the company's subsidiary structure, each nominally registered to a different entity, but traceable with the right documentation, back to a shell company that ultimately connected to a personal account in Jonathan's name. Money had been flowing through these accounts for 3 years, not a small amount. Karen's preliminary figures subject to verification suggested between $2 and $3 million had been redirected from the company money that should have gone into operational accounts, employee profit-sharing funds, vendor payments, and funneled instead into this personal structure. Employee profit-sharing funds. Claire went very still when Karen told her that. Tell me about the employees, she said. Karen explained. There was a profit-sharing plan that had been marketed to the company's construction crews and office staff as a significant benefit of working for Whitmore. Jonathan had presented it at a company meeting 2 years ago as a major commitment to the people who helped build the company. Claire had watched him give that speech. He had been passionate and generous-sounding, and she had been proud of him. The plan existed on paper. The contributions were made. But the contributions, rather than being held in the protected accounts they were supposed to be held in, had been quietly redirected. The workers believed they were building savings. They believed Jonathan Whitmore valued them enough to invest in their futures. He had been using their money to fund his personal lifestyle. Claire didn't sleep that night. She lay in the dark of the room she had shared with her husband for 5 years, and she thought about the construction workers, men and women who got up early and went home tired and believed that their employer was looking out for them, and something shifted inside her that had nothing to do with her marriage or her daughter or her own survival. She thought this cannot be allowed to continue. She thought he has to be stopped. She thought I am the only person in a position to stop him. When she called Rachel the next morning, her voice was different. Rachel noticed it. Something changed, Rachel said. It's not just about me anymore, Claire said. I want to make sure the employees are protected. I want whatever legal framework we're building to include the recovery of what he took from them. There was a pause. Then Rachel said, That's going to make this significantly more complex. I know, Claire said. You're 7 months pregnant. I know, Claire said again. You understand that expanding the scope of this changes the kind of attention it will get, the kind of legal resources he'll throw at it, Rachel, Claire said quietly. Rachel stopped. I understand all of it, Claire said. Let's keep going. On a Tuesday morning in early December, Derek placed the mail on Jonathan Whitmore's desk at 9:15. Jonathan was mid-story, mid-laugh, mid-champagne, mid-everything he believed his life had become. He picked up the plain white envelope at the bottom of the stack. He tore it open, still smiling, and the world he had spent 6 years building, the world he had built mostly by taking what Claire Bennett gave him and claiming it as his own, began in that moment to end. He didn't know it yet. He still thought he could win, but Claire had spent 3 months making sure that by the time those papers landed on his desk, winning was no longer an option that belonged to him. The divorce papers weren't a goodbye. They were a beginning. And Jonathan Whitmore, for all his ambition and power and carefully constructed control, had made one mistake that he couldn't recover from. He had let Claire Bennett build his entire world, and he had never once imagined she might know exactly how to take it apart. Richard Calloway arrived at Jonathan's office in under 20 minutes. That was fast even for Richard, who had been Jonathan's attorney for 4 years and had learned that when Jonathan called with that particular tone in his voice, flat, controlled, dangerously quiet, you didn't stop to finish your coffee. He walked in to find the champagne glasses gone from the desk, replaced by the divorce papers spread across the entire surface in some kind of frantic reorganization, as if Jonathan had been sorting them by how threatening they were. Victoria was standing near the window with her arms crossed, watching Jonathan, the way you watch a dog you're not sure about. Richard set his briefcase on the chair and looked at the papers without touching them. "How bad?" he said. Jonathan looked at him. "Read the 3rd tab." Richard flipped to it. He read for 90 seconds without speaking. Then he turned to the 5th tab, then the 8th. He closed the document and was quiet for a moment. "Jonathan," he said carefully. "Don't," Jonathan said. "I need to ask you directly. I said don't. Did she have authorized access to these accounts?" The silence that followed that question was its own kind of answer. Jonathan walked to the window and stood with his back to both of them. Outside Chicago moved the way it always moved, indifferent, enormous, full of people who had no idea that 42 floors above them, a man's carefully constructed world was cracking at its foundation. "She built those financial systems," Jonathan said finally. 6 years ago, when the company was nothing, she built them. "So technically she designed the architecture that all of it runs on," Jonathan said. "But I removed her access 2 years ago. I changed everything." "Everything," Richard said. Another silence. "Most things," Jonathan admitted. Richard sat down. He pressed 2 fingers against his temple in a gesture that Jonathan recognized as Richard's version of a very bad sign. "Jonathan, I need you to tell me about the loan guarantees." Victoria's head turned sharply. "What loan guarantees?" Neither man looked at her. Jonathan said, "That's not your concern." Richard said, "The filing references personal guarantees totaling approximately $8 million bearing Mrs. Whitmore's signature. Were those guarantees signed with her knowledge and consent?" The question sat in the room like something physical. Jonathan didn't answer. Richard stood up slowly, and there was something in the way he did it, the deliberateness of it, the way he straightened his jacket before he spoke, that made even Victoria go still. "Jonathan," Richard said, "I have been your attorney for 4 years. I have handled things for you that I am not proud of. But I need you to understand something clearly as your lawyer and as someone who still has his own bar license to protect." He paused. "If those signatures were not obtained with her informed consent, we are no longer talking about a divorce proceeding. We are talking about something else entirely." Jonathan turned from the window. His face in that moment was not the face of a powerful man. It was the face of a man trying to calculate how much damage he could contain and coming up short on the math. "Fix it," he said. "I can't fix fraud, Jonathan." "Then make it go away." "It doesn't go away," Richard said. "Not with a paper trail this organized." He gestured at the document spread across the desk. Whoever helped her put this together knew exactly what they were looking for. This isn't a desperate wife who got angry and called a divorce lawyer. This is a structured legal and financial case that has been built over months. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Jonathan understood. He just didn't want to say it out loud, because saying it out loud would mean acknowledging that Claire, quiet, pregnant, supposedly helpless Claire, had been inside his blind spot for months, doing exactly what he had once watched her do for his company, finding every weakness, documenting every discrepancy, and building a structure that was, by the time anyone else saw it, already finished. He had watched her do it before. He had relied on it before. And somehow, in all his certainty about controlling her, he had forgotten that she was still the same person who had walked into his disaster of a company one Tuesday morning and fixed everything before he even fully understood it was broken. Victoria's voice came from across the room, sharp and impatient. "Will someone please tell me what is actually happening?" Jonathan looked at her. Something crossed his face. Not warmth, not reassurance, but a quick calculation, the same look he got when he was deciding how to present bad news to an investor. And in that look, had she been paying attention, Victoria might have understood something important about the man she had spent the last 2 years believing was in love with her. But she wasn't paying attention to his face. She was waiting for his words. "It's being handled," he said. And Richard, picking up his briefcase, said nothing at all. Because Richard Calloway, in the 20 minutes since he had walked into this office, had privately decided two things. First, that he needed to review very carefully what exposure his own past work for Jonathan Whitmore might create for him if this went where it looked like it was going. And second, that being handled was not a phrase any honest attorney could apply to this situation. He left without finishing his sentence. And Jonathan watched him go, standing alone in the office that had always felt like proof of how far he'd come, suddenly aware that the distance between where he stood right now and where he could fall was much shorter than he had ever allowed himself to believe. 3 floors below, in the building's lobby, Richard Calloway stopped at the elevator bank and pulled out his phone. He stood there for a moment, not dialing anyone, just holding it. He thought about the loan guarantees. He thought about the paper trail. He thought about the methodical, tabbed, annotated precision of those divorce documents. He thought about Claire Whitmore, 7 months pregnant, doing that work alone. He put his phone in his pocket and walked out into the cold. He would make some calls, but not the calls Jonathan was expecting. The one thing Richard had not told Jonathan, the thing he had seen in tab 11 of the divorce filing that he'd chosen in the moment, not to mention, was a single paragraph at the bottom of a supplementary exhibit. A paragraph noting that Claire Whitmore was a named co-founder of Whitmore Construction LLC under the original Articles of Incorporation filed 6 years ago, and that her ownership stake, which had never been formally dissolved, legally entitled her to significant decision-making rights within the company. Rights that Jonathan had been exercising on her behalf without her knowledge for 6 years. Which meant that everything Jonathan had built, every deal, every contract, every subsidiary, every profit had been built at least partially on a foundation that still had Claire Bennett Whitmore's name on it. He hadn't erased her. He had buried her. And there was a difference, legally speaking, that was going to matter enormously. But Jonathan didn't know about tab 11 yet. And so for the rest of that Tuesday, he did what he always did when he felt something slipping. He tried to get ahead of it. He called his PR contact first. A man named Davis, who had spent 15 years managing crises for Chicago's Powerful, and who answered on the second ring with the practiced calm of someone who had heard everything. "I may need you to help me manage a story," Jonathan said. "What kind of story?" "Divorce. My wife has filed. She's going to try to make it messy." "Is there anything that could make it messy?" Davis asked, because that was always the first question. Jonathan was quiet for 2 seconds too long. "Nothing that can't be contextualized," he said. Davis said, "Okay, what's your preferred narrative?" And Jonathan, standing in his office alone, now stared at the divorce papers on his desk and said the thing he had been building toward for the better part of a year. The thing he had actually planned quietly and deliberately as his exit strategy from a marriage he had stopped valuing. "She's been emotionally unstable throughout the pregnancy," he said. "I've been concerned about her mental health for months. I have documentation of her erratic behavior. I'm going to need the story to be that I filed for her protection and the protection of our child." Davis said nothing for a moment. Then, "She filed first." "That's a detail," Jonathan said. "Details can be reframed." "Jonathan," Davis said slowly, "if there's any chance she has real documentation of financial irregularities." "There isn't," Jonathan said. Another 2-second pause. "All right," Davis said. "I'll start working on positioning. But Jonathan, if anything comes out that contradicts the mental health narrative, it'll make everything worse. You understand that?" "Nothing's coming out," Jonathan said. He believed it when he said it. That was perhaps the most remarkable thing about Jonathan Whitmore, his capacity for self-conviction. He had told so many stories about himself for so long that he had genuinely lost the ability to distinguish between the version of events he needed to believe and the version that was actually true. He was not in the clinical sense a liar. He was something more dangerous, a man who had restructured his own memory to match his own narrative so completely that challenging him felt to him like being attacked without cause. Claire had understood this about him for a long time. It was part of why she had never confronted him directly, because a direct confrontation with Jonathan was not a conversation. It was a performance. He would produce emotion, produce context, produce alternative explanations with such confident fluency that you would find yourself questioning your own certainty, even when the documents in your hand said otherwise. She had watched him do it with investors. She had watched him do it with contractors. She had watched him do it with her for years, until she finally stopped bringing things to him and started writing them down instead. You couldn't out-talk a man like Jonathan, but you could out-document him. And that was exactly what she had done. 22 miles away in the Oak Park house that belonged to her sister Amy, Claire sat at the kitchen table and felt her daughter move. It wasn't a flutter anymore. At 7 months, the movement was something else entirely, a deliberate shifting, a small but insistent pressure that reminded Claire every time it happened that there was a person in there, a whole person already growing impatient. "She's awake," Amy said from across the table, watching Claire's expression. "She's always awake when I'm stressed," Claire said. "I think she knows." Amy pushed a cup of tea across the table. "Rachel called me while you were resting. She said the papers were delivered." Claire wrapped her hands around the mug. "I know, she texted me. How do you feel?" Claire thought about it honestly, the way she tried to do everything without performance, without the version she was supposed to feel. "Terrified," she said, "and strangely calm at the same time. Is that possible?" "With you?" Amy said. "Absolutely." Claire almost smiled. Then she said, "He's going to call his PR person today, Davis. I've seen his name in Jonathan's phone contacts more than once." She paused. "He's going to try to get ahead of the story. He's going to position me as unstable." Amy's jaw tightened. "Can he do that?" "He's going to try," Claire said. "He's been setting it up for months. Little comments at events about how hard the pregnancy has been for me emotionally, making sure certain people heard certain things." She looked at the steam rising from her mug. "He's been building the narrative since before I filed. He just didn't know I was building one too." "Claire," Amy said, and her voice had something in it, not quite fear, but the closest Amy ever got to it. "Are you sure about this, all of it? Because once this is fully in motion—" "It's already in motion," Claire said quietly. "It was in motion the night I found that restaurant charge and sat at the kitchen table by myself and felt our daughter move for the first time without him there." She paused. "That was the night I stopped waiting for him to become the person I needed him to be, and I started just taking care of us." Amy was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Dad would be so proud of you." Claire looked down at her mug. "Dad would tell me to check my documentation twice," she said. "And even through everything, through the fear and the exhaustion and the particular loneliness of being heavily pregnant while quietly dismantling your own marriage." She laughed a little, because he absolutely would have. Rachel Morgan called at 4 that afternoon, not on the second phone but on Claire's regular phone, because they had agreed that from this point forward, it no longer mattered if Jonathan saw Rachel's name on Claire's call log. The papers were filed, the clock was running. There was no more need for the careful concealment that had governed the last 3 months. "He's retained new counsel," Rachel said, skipping any greeting. "Richard Calloway." "No, actually. Calloway's office sent a notice this morning that he's withdrawing from the representation. Conflict of interest, the notice said, though they didn't specify." There was something careful in Rachel's voice. "Jonathan has retained Marcus Webb." Claire knew that name. Everyone in Chicago legal circles knew that name. Marcus Webb was 63 years old, had never lost a high-profile family case in his career, and was known for 2 things: an absolute willingness to attack opposing parties with every legal tool available, and a particular talent for making women in contentious divorces look unstable, erratic, and incapable. He had built his reputation on it. Claire's hand tightened slightly on the phone. "That's his move," she said. "He's going to let Webb build the mental health narrative. Webb specializes in it." "Yes," Rachel said, "which is why what I'm about to tell you matters. Karen finished the preliminary forensic analysis this morning. She has enough to file a fraud complaint with the state attorney's office independently of the divorce proceeding." Claire was quiet. "If we file that complaint," Rachel continued, "it changes the entire landscape. The divorce stops being a private matter between 2 parties and becomes part of a broader investigation. Jonathan loses control of the narrative because the story is no longer bitter wife versus successful husband. The story becomes ongoing fraud investigation. Marcus Webb cannot spin that. And the employees," Claire said, "the profit-sharing funds. Karen's figures are solid enough to include in the complaint. It's the strongest part of the case, honestly, because it involves third-party victims. The DA's office takes that seriously." Claire breathed slowly. This was the moment she had been building toward for 3 months, and now that it was actually here in the form of a real decision with real consequences, she felt the full weight of it. Not doubt exactly, not hesitation. More like the feeling of standing at the edge of something very high and looking down, not because you're afraid to jump, but because you want to be completely sure that you know exactly what's below you before you do. She thought about Jonathan calling his PR man, planning his narrative, positioning her as unstable. She thought about the workers who got up early every morning believing their employer had invested in their future. She thought about her daughter moving inside her right now, restless and alive. "File it," Claire said. Rachel said, "I'll contact Karen tonight. We move by end of week." After she hung up, Claire sat alone in Amy's kitchen for a long time. She was not in that silence thinking about Jonathan. She was thinking about the original articles of incorporation she had found in her own files, the document that established in legal language that had never been changed or dissolved, that Claire Bennett Whitmore was a co-founder of the company that Jonathan had spent 6 years presenting as his sole creation. She had not told Rachel about that document yet. She had been holding it, not because she wasn't sure about it. She was completely sure about it. But because there was a right moment for every piece of information, and this particular piece was not the opening move. It was not even the middle move. It was the move you made when the other side believed they had already won. She had learned that from watching Jonathan actually. He always played his strongest cards too early when he was frightened. When he felt control slipping, he reached for his most powerful tools, immediately burning them before the other side had fully committed. It was the one consistent weakness of a man who trusted his own dominance too completely. He never imagined he might need to save something for later. Claire had imagined exactly that. For 3 months, she had imagined exactly that. The fraud complaint landed in the state attorney's office on a Friday morning. By Friday afternoon, 2 investigators from the Financial Crimes Unit had made contact with Karen Yu and requested the underlying documentation. By Friday evening, a reporter at the Chicago Tribune's business desk had received a tip, not from Claire's team, which had been scrupulously careful about press contact, but from somewhere else entirely, a source that Rachel would later speculate had been inside Jonathan's own professional circle, someone who had seen the writing on the wall and decided to create distance between themselves and the falling structure. Jonathan found out about the fraud complaint from Davis, his PR man who called him at 6:45 on Friday evening in a tone that had none of the practiced calm of their earlier conversation. "Jonathan," Davis said, "the state attorney's office has received a fraud complaint. It's connected to your company accounts. My contact at the Tribune says they're working on a story for next week." Jonathan was at a restaurant when the call came in, not with Victoria alone, which was unusual for him. He had been for the past 3 days since the papers arrived oscillating between furious energy and a strange, heavy stillness that the people around him found more unsettling than the fury. He left the restaurant without eating. He sat in his car outside and called Marcus Webb. "Tell me what our options are," he said. Webb's voice was measured experience, the voice of a man who had navigated disasters professionally for 30 years. "Our options depend on what exactly is in that complaint. Do you have any idea what documentation they've provided?" "Some," Jonathan said. "Not all. He didn't know about tab 11. He still didn't know about the co-founder documentation. He knew about the loan guarantees, and he knew about the financial transfers, because those were his own actions, and he could inventory them. But Claire's information had layers he hadn't mapped yet, and that uncertainty was its own particular kind of torture. "Jonathan," Webb said, "I need you to be completely honest with me because I cannot protect you from things I don't know about. Are there other documents beyond what was in the divorce filing that could be used against you?" Jonathan thought about that question for a long time. Then he said, "There might be." Webb said, "What kind of documents?" And Jonathan, sitting alone in his car on a Chicago street on a Friday night, finally said the words out loud that he had been refusing to say for 3 days. "The original company founding documents," he said, "from 6 years ago. There's a co-founder designation that was never formally changed." Silence. Then Webb said very slowly and very carefully, "Jonathan, are you telling me that your wife has a legal co-founder claim on the company?" Jonathan said nothing. "Jonathan, I'm telling you," Jonathan said, "that it's complicated." Webb said, "How large a stake are we talking about?" Jonathan didn't answer that either, because the answer was 40%, 40% of everything. 40% of the company he had built into a $40 million enterprise, 40% of the assets, 40% of the decisions, 40% that Claire Bennett Whitmore had under the law never stopped owning, even as Jonathan had spent 6 years behaving as though she didn't exist. Webb breathed out slowly on the other end of the phone. "I need you to come to my office tomorrow morning," he said. "First thing. And Jonathan, he paused, don't talk to anyone else tonight. Not Victoria, not your board, not Davis. No one. Jonathan said, understood. He sat in the car for another 10 minutes after he hung up. He thought for the first time with genuine honesty about the night 6 years ago, when Claire had handed him a clean financial report across a conference table, and he had looked at her and said, how do I thank you? And she had said, pay your consulting invoice on time. He had found that funny then, the practicality of it, the total lack of performance. Most people, when they saved someone, wanted the moment acknowledged dramatically. Claire had wanted payment terms respected. He had thought that meant she was easy to manage. He had thought practicality without performance meant she didn't really understand power. Sitting in his car on that Friday night with a fraud complaint in the state attorney's office and a reporter working a story at the Tribune and a co-founder designation that 40% of his empire still belonged to, he understood with the particular clarity that only catastrophe can produce exactly how wrong he had been. She hadn't been easy to manage. She had been patient. There was a difference, and the difference, it turned out, was everything. Across the city, in Amy's house, Claire was lying on the couch with her feet up because Rachel had told her firmly that she needed to rest, and Amy had enforced it with the specific no-argument energy that only an older sister can produce. The television was on, but the sound was low, and Claire wasn't really watching it. She was thinking about the investor event Jonathan had been planning for 2 weeks from now. A major presentation, his biggest of the year, hundreds of attendees, press coverage. The kind of event designed to cement his reputation as Chicago's most important real estate developer. She had received the invitation. Jonathan's assistant had sent it to her automatically because her name was still on the company's formal guest list, because Jonathan had never thought to remove it. She had not yet decided whether to attend, but she was thinking about it. She was thinking about the room full of investors and employees and reporters who would be there expecting Jonathan Whitmore's version of Jonathan Whitmore's story. And she was thinking about what it might mean for the employees, whose futures he had stolen, for the women who came after her, for everyone who had been caught in the machinery of a man who believed his own myth so completely that he had stopped being careful if someone walked into that room with the truth. Her daughter moved again, a long, rolling motion this time, so pronounced that Claire looked down at her own stomach with something between awe and amusement. I know, she said quietly to her daughter, to the room, to no one and everyone. I'm working on it. Marcus Webb arrived at his own office at 6:45 on Saturday morning, 30 minutes before Jonathan, because Marcus Webb had not survived 30 years of high-profile litigation by being unprepared. He had read the divorce filing twice the night before. He had called 2 colleagues who knew Karen Yu's reputation from her FBI work. And he had pulled the original Whitmore Construction Incorporation documents from a public records database at 11 o'clock at night in his home office because something Jonathan had said on the phone had made the back of his neck go cold, and he needed to see the actual paperwork before he faced the man in the morning. He sat with the documents in front of him when Jonathan walked in. He did not stand to greet him. He said, "Sit down." Jonathan sat. Webb pushed the incorporation documents across the desk without speaking. He watched Jonathan look at them, watched his jaw tighten, then go slack, then tighten again. "You've seen these," Jonathan said. It wasn't a question. "I pulled them last night," Webb said. "I need to understand something, and I need you to tell me the truth, because I am not interested in being blindsided twice in 1 week by the same case." He leaned forward. "Did you know when you began restructuring the company over the past 4 years that these co-founder designations had never been legally dissolved?" Jonathan looked at the documents. "I knew," he said. Webb was quiet for 3 seconds. "You knew that your wife held a 40% co-founder stake in a company you were treating as your sole property. She wasn't involved in day-to-day operations anymore." "Jonathan," Webb said, and there was no softness in his voice, none at all. "That is irrelevant to the legal question of whether she held an ownership stake. A shareholder does not forfeit their shares by not showing up to work." He stood and walked to the window, which was something Webb did when he was choosing his words very carefully. "I need you to understand your actual position right now, because I don't think you fully do." He turned. "The fraud complaint changes the framework of the divorce. It introduces the possibility of criminal investigation, which creates implications for asset protection that go beyond anything a family law strategy can address. And the co-founder designation." He paused. Jonathan, if a court rules that her ownership stake was active and ongoing while you were making unilateral decisions about company finances, you are not looking at a divorce settlement. You are looking at something much more serious. Jonathan said, "What do you mean more serious?" "I mean," Webb said carefully, "that decisions made by a sole operator over assets that legally belonged in part to someone else, without that person's knowledge or consent, could be characterized as something beyond poor business judgment." Jonathan stared at him. "I need you," Webb said, "to tell me every decision you made in the last 4 years that involved company assets that you did not consult your wife about and that she did not explicitly authorize." Jonathan was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, "That could take a while." Webb said, "I have all morning." What followed was 2 hours that Jonathan would spend the rest of his life not thinking about if he could help it, because there was something specifically humiliating about sitting across from your own attorney and itemizing one by one the decisions you had made in the comfortable certainty that no one could touch you, only to watch a 63-year-old man with 30 years of experience write them down with the expression of someone totaling a bill they already know is going to be very large. By the time they finished, Webb had 4 pages of notes. He looked at them. Then he looked at Jonathan. "You need to understand," he said, "that my job is to protect you within the limits of the law. I can build arguments. I can challenge evidence. I can create procedural complications that slow things down, but I cannot make these facts not exist." He set down his pen. "What I can tell you is this. Your strongest play right now is a negotiated settlement. Before this goes further, before the Tribune story runs, before the fraud investigation gets momentum." Jonathan said, "You want me to settle." "I want you to survive this with some portion of your future intact," Webb said. "Yes." Jonathan stood up. He walked to the window. He stood with his hands in his pockets and looked out at the city for a long moment, and Webb watched him and recognized the specific posture of a man who had not yet accepted the reality he was standing inside of. "She won't settle," Jonathan said finally. "That's not what this is about for her." "What is it about for her?" Jonathan turned, and for the first time in the entire conversation there was something honest in his face. Not remorse exactly, but something closer to recognition. "She's not angry," he said slowly, as if the realization was arriving as he said it. "She was never angry. She was building something. She's been building something this whole time, and I thought she was just—" He stopped. "Just what?" Webb said. Jonathan shook his head. "Waiting," he said. Webb studied him for a moment. Then he said, "If she's not interested in a settlement, then we need to prepare for the investor event." Jonathan looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Webb said, "that based on everything you've told me this morning and based on the timing of the fraud complaint, I believe your wife or her attorney may be planning to use your investor event as a public forum. It is the highest visibility moment on your calendar in the next 30 days, and visibility is what they need right now to prevent you from controlling the story." Jonathan's expression shifted. "She wouldn't." Webb said nothing. "She wouldn't do that," Jonathan said again, and this time his voice had something in it that was almost desperate. "Not 8 months pregnant, not publicly. She's not like that." Webb looked at him with the patient expression of someone who has heard many men describe the women who were about to destroy them as incapable of exactly that. "Jonathan," he said, "with respect, you have been wrong about her before." The silence that followed was absolute. And Jonathan Whitmore, standing in his attorney's office on a Saturday morning with 4 pages of his own decisions lined up against him, finally felt the specific cold weight of a truth he had been refusing for years. He had never actually known his wife at all. He had known the version of her that was useful to him. He had known her capability when he needed it, her presence when he required it, her silence when he demanded it. But the person underneath all of that, the woman who had grown up listening to her father explain that numbers never lie, the woman who had rebuilt a stranger's company in 3 days and asked only for invoice compliance in return, the woman who had spent the last 3 months sitting in a quiet room documenting every betrayal with the unhurried focus of someone who already knew how the story ended that person he had never understood. He had been so busy managing her that he had never bothered to see her. And now it was too late. 2 days after that Saturday morning meeting on a Monday, the Tribune story ran. Not on the front page, not yet. It was in the business section, 3 columns with the headline, "Whitmore Construction Under State Investigation for Alleged Financial Irregularities." The story was careful and factual, and cited only sources it could verify, which meant it was limited in scope, but entirely accurate in every detail it contained. It mentioned the fraud complaint. It mentioned the forensic accounting. It mentioned in the final paragraph that the investigation had been initiated in connection with divorce proceedings filed by Claire Whitmore, co-founder. Co-founder. The word sat in the middle of that paragraph like a stone. Jonathan read the story at 6 in the morning on his phone, standing in the kitchen of the house he had shared with Claire for 5 years, which still felt like her house in ways he had never acknowledged, because she had chosen everything in it, not decoratively but structurally, with the same practical intelligence she brought to everything. The layout of the storage, the organization of the pantry, the specific positioning of the kitchen table near the window so that whoever sat there in the morning got the light. He had always assumed the house was his because his name was on the mortgage. He had never thought about whose decisions had made it livable. His phone started ringing at 6:15. It didn't stop until after 9. Board members, investors, a city alderman he had worked with on 2 development projects, his brother in Milwaukee, who hadn't spoken to him in 8 months over a separate financial dispute. His assistant Derek, who called not about business but to ask in a voice that was younger and less controlled than his professional manner whether the story about the profit-sharing funds was true. That call was the one Jonathan couldn't finish. Derek had been with him for 3 years. He was 27 years old. He had enrolled in that profit-sharing plan on his 3rd month of employment because Jonathan had made a speech about how the company took care of its people, and Derek had believed him and had been contributing 15% of every paycheck for 2.5 years into an account that he believed was building his future. "Is it true?" Derek said. "Is the money gone?" Jonathan said. "Derek." "Just tell me," Derek said, and his voice cracked slightly. "I need to know if the money is gone," Jonathan said. "I can't discuss the specifics right now." The silence on the other end was devastating. "Okay," Derek said finally, very quietly. "Okay." He hung up. Jonathan set the phone down on the kitchen counter and stood there. And the strange thing, the thing that surprised even him, was that it was Derek's call, not the board members, not the investors, not the alderman that broke through something. Because Derek was just a 27-year-old kid who had believed him, who had trusted him with 15% of every paycheck for 2.5 years, who had called not to threaten or to strategize, but just to ask a simple question, "Is the money gone?" Jonathan had not answered it, which was in its own way the most honest thing he had done in years. That same Monday morning at Amy's house, Rachel Morgan sat across from Claire at the kitchen table and spread out a new set of documents. Not legal filings this time, something else. A printed copy of the Tribune article on top of which Rachel had placed a handwritten list. "Former employees," Rachel said. 7 of them so far who have reached out to Karen Yu's office since the article ran this morning. Construction workers, an office manager, a site supervisor. All of them enrolled in the profit-sharing plan. All of them wanting to know what happened to their money and how to be part of this. Claire looked at the list. 7 in one morning, she said. Karen thinks there could be 40 or 50 total when they finish identifying all plan participants, Rachel said. Claire was quiet. "There's something else," Rachel said. She pulled a separate document from her folder. Marcus Webb filed a motion this morning requesting a 30-day stay of the divorce proceedings to allow for settlement negotiations. She said it in front of Claire. "He wants to talk." Claire read the motion. Then she looked up at Rachel. "What does he think we'll settle for?" she said. Rachel said, "Their opening offer informally communicated before the motion is $2.5 million full custody for Jonathan with generous visitation for you and a non-disclosure agreement covering all financial details." The kitchen was very quiet. Amy, who was standing at the counter and had been pretending not to listen, stopped pretending. Claire looked at the motion for another moment. Then she said, "No." Rachel nodded. She had expected that. "I'll communicate your position. But Claire, when I decline it, escalates. He'll have Webb file aggressive motions. There will be attempts to access your medical records, your communications, anything that supports the mental instability narrative. It will get uglier before it gets resolved." "I know," Claire said, "and the investor event is in 12 days. "I know that too," Claire said. Rachel looked at her carefully. "Are you planning to go?" Claire was quiet for a moment. Her hand moved almost unconsciously to rest on her stomach. Then she said, "I've been thinking about it since the day the papers were filed." "Claire," Rachel said, and her voice was gentle but direct, If you go to that event and confront him publicly, it changes everything. The press will be there. His investors will be there. Whatever happens in that room will be the story, and it will be the story for a long time." "I know," Claire said for the third time. "It will also be extremely hard," Rachel said. "Emotionally, physically. You are 8 months pregnant." "I know that better than anyone," Claire said. And there was something in her voice, not bitterness, not performance, just the clear, steady fact of someone who has been living inside the hardest part of something for a long time and has stopped being surprised by how hard it is. She looked at Rachel. "Tell me what we'd need," she said. "If I went, what would we need to make it count?" Rachel looked at her for a long moment. Then she opened her folder again. "Sit with me," she said, "and let's think through it." What neither of them knew yet, what no one outside Jonathan's inner circle knew, was what Jonathan had decided that same morning while his phone rang without stopping, and Derek's quiet "okay" echoed in the kitchen. He had called Victoria, not to comfort her, not because he missed her or needed her, or any of the things that a man in a genuine relationship calls for. He called her because Victoria Hale, in addition to being the woman he had been seeing for 2 years, was also the daughter of a man named Gerald Hale, who sat on the boards of 3 Chicago financial institutions, and who had over the past 18 months been a quiet but significant silent partner in 2 of Jonathan's development projects. Jonathan needed Gerald Hale to stay quiet. More specifically, he needed Gerald Hale to not talk to the investigators, who were now, according to a contact at the state attorney's office, beginning the process of identifying all parties connected to the financial accounts under scrutiny. Victoria answered on the 3rd ring. "I saw the article," she said. Her voice was different from any voice Jonathan had heard from her before. Flat, careful, the voice of someone who had been doing their own calculations since 6 that morning. "I need to talk to your father," Jonathan said. A pause. "My father," Victoria said slowly, "called me this morning before the article ran. Someone told him last night." Another pause. "He's already spoken to his attorney." Jonathan went very still. "What did his attorney tell him?" Jonathan said. "To cooperate with investigators," Victoria said. Jonathan closed his eyes. "Victoria, Jonathan," she said, and her voice was no longer flat. It was something else now, not angry, not sad, but with a kind of terrible clarity in it that Jonathan had not heard before and that made something in his chest go tight. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." He said nothing. He waited. "Did you ever actually intend to leave her?" Victoria said. "Before all of this, was there ever a real plan? Or was I—" She stopped, started again. "Was I just something else you were managing?" The question hung between them on the phone. Jonathan opened his mouth and found for the first time in longer than he could remember that he had no version of the answer that served him. No framing, no narrative. The question was too direct and too simple, and it had cut straight through every layer of his usual self-presentation and landed somewhere that only the truth could reach. He said nothing. Victoria said, "Okay, just that, okay." The same word Derek had used in the same quiet tone with the same weight behind it. She hung up. Jonathan stood in his kitchen alone for the 2nd time that morning, and this time the silence was total. No ringing phone, no movement. Just a man standing in the middle of a house that had always felt like someone else's home, finally running out of people who were willing to receive his calls. Gerald Hale's cooperation with investigators was confirmed by Wednesday. It was a significant development because Hale's partnership in the 2 development projects had been structured in a way that gave him access to certain financial communications and documentation that Jonathan had assumed were protected by their partnership agreement. They were not. Hale's attorney had found a provision that allowed cooperation with legal process without triggering the confidentiality clause, and Gerald Hale, who had spent 40 years building a reputation in Chicago's financial community and was not interested in spending the next phase of his life managing a fraud association, had taken it. Karen Yu called Rachel with the news. Rachel called Claire. "Hale is cooperating," Rachel said, "which means we now have a corroborating source for 2 of the transfers. Jonathan is going to know by end of day, and when he does—" She paused. "Rachel, I think you need to be ready for him to move." "Move how?" Claire said. "He's going to try to refile the custody motion before we can get in front of a judge on the fraud issues. Marcus Webb is good enough to know that the best leverage Jonathan has left is the custody question, and he's going to push it before the criminal investigation framework locks him out of family court maneuvering." Claire's hand tightened on the phone. "Can he do that?" she said. "Can he use the custody motion to create leverage?" "Not successfully," Rachel said. "Not with the documentation we have, but it will create noise. It will create a period of legal complexity that could be stressful and disruptive, especially with you so close to your due date." Her voice softened slightly. "Claire, I need to tell you something, and I want to say it as your attorney, but also as someone who has watched you handle this with more composure than most people could manage." Claire waited. "You don't have to do the investor event," Rachel said. "I know you're thinking about it. I know why, but you have already done enough. The fraud complaint is filed. Hale is cooperating. The Tribune story is running. The employees are coming forward. The machine is in motion. You don't have to walk into that room 8 months pregnant just to see his face when it all comes down." Claire was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Rachel, do you know why I went to the meeting with you the first time? The first time I came to your office before we had any of this in place?" Rachel said. "Tell me." "Because I found my daughter's heartbeat on a Tuesday night when Jonathan wasn't there," Claire said. "She moved and I put my hand on my stomach and I thought about all the things I had accepted and made excuses for and told myself we're fine because I was afraid of what the alternative looked like. And I decided that I didn't want her to watch me make that choice." She paused. "I don't want her to inherit my silence." Rachel said nothing. "The investor event isn't about Jonathan," Claire said. "It's not about watching him fall. It's about the employees who are going to be in that room who built what he built, whose money he took, who deserve to hear the truth from someone who was actually there." She paused. "And it's about making sure that the story that gets told is the real one. Because if I don't tell it, Davis and Webb and Jonathan will spend the next 18 months building a different story, and people will believe it because they always believe the powerful man over the inconvenient woman." Rachel was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "All right, then let's make sure when you walk into that room you have everything." The investor event was now 8 days away. And in those 8 days, Jonathan's world continued to come apart at a pace that no PR strategy and no legal maneuvering could fully arrest, because the thing about a structure built on concealment is that once the concealment starts to give way, the reveals come faster than the responses. On Thursday, 2 more board members requested an emergency meeting with Webb to understand their own legal exposure. On Friday, a second Tribune story ran this one on the front page of the business section, with additional detail about the profit-sharing plan and a photograph of the original company founding documents. Someone at the newspaper had obtained a copy. No one on Claire's legal team had provided it. Rachel had been scrupulous about that, but the documents were public record, had always been public record, and the Tribune had a researcher who knew how to use a public records database. The word co-founder appeared 6 times in the story. By Saturday, Jonathan's investor event had lost 4 confirmed attendees, 2 of whom sent formal regrets, and 2 of whom simply stopped returning Derek's calls. Derek, for his part, had stopped coming to work. He had sent a brief email saying he was taking personal days. Jonathan had not responded to the email. Victoria had not called since Monday. Her father had not called at all. Jonathan spent that Saturday in his office alone with the door closed. At some point in the afternoon, he picked up his phone and found himself scrolling to Claire's number. He looked at it for a long time. He thought about calling. He thought about what he would say. He ran through several versions in his head. Every version that started with an apology sounded like strategy. Every version that started with an explanation sounded like lying. He put the phone face down on the desk. He sat in the quiet. And in the quiet, something happened to Jonathan Whitmore that had not happened in a very long time. He thought about the early years, not as a story he told at dinners, not as part of the origin narrative he had polished and deployed so many times it had become theater. He thought about it, actually, the fear the morning he had walked into that conference room expecting bankruptcy and walked out with a clean report, and a woman who had somehow fixed his life in 3 days without making him feel small about needing it fixed. I thought about how rare that was. Not the competence, though the competence was extraordinary, but the way she had done it, without ego, without weaponizing it, just done it, handed it to him, and asked for invoice compliance. He had called that easy. He had called that manageable. He sat in his office and finally understood that what he had actually called it was safe. He had felt safe with her. And then as he had grown powerful, and the safety had started to feel like a limitation rather than a gift, he had begun the slow work of making her small, because a man like Jonathan Whitmore could not tolerate the idea that his safety depended on someone else. He had been afraid of needing her, so he had spent years making sure she needed him instead, and she had seen it. She had seen all of it quietly and without drama, and she had done the only thing that Claire Bennett had always done with a problem she couldn't solve by talking about it. She had started taking notes. He almost laughed. He didn't because there was nothing to laugh at, but almost. 8 days. 8 days until the investor event. 8 days until the room full of people who had been told Jonathan Whitmore's story in Jonathan Whitmore's words would hear it told differently by the woman who had been there for every chapter he had left out. He didn't know yet that she was coming, but some part of him, the part that had once been frightened and had once been honest and had once sat across a conference table from a 26-year-old financial analyst who fixed everything he had broken, some part of him already suspected. Because he knew finally completely without the shield of his own self-conviction, to soften it, she was still the same person who had walked into disaster and built something clean. And he had given her 6 years of material. The morning of the investor event arrived the way that mornings always arrive when something enormous is about to happen quietly without ceremony, as if the day itself hadn't been told what was coming. Jonathan was up at 5. He had not slept well. Not well was an understatement. He had not slept at all in any meaningful way, had lain in the dark of the bedroom that still smelled faintly like Claire's shampoo because he had not changed the pillowcase, drifting in and out of something that was not rest. At some point around 3 in the morning, he had given up and sat at the desk in his home office with a glass of water he didn't drink, going through the notes Webb had prepared for his speech. The speech was good. Webb had worked on it with Davis for 3 days, and it was a masterpiece of controlled narrative, confident, forward-looking, acknowledging the investigation in a single paragraph that framed it as a misunderstanding rooted in a difficult personal situation, pivoting smoothly to the company's fundamentals, its assets, its projected growth. It said everything the investors needed to hear without technically lying about anything that could be immediately disproven. Jonathan had read it 6 times. He could not get through it without hearing Derek's voice in his head. Is the money gone? He put the notes down at 4:30 and sat in the quiet. At 5, he was dressed. At 5:45, he was in a car heading downtown. The event didn't start until 9, but Jonathan had always arrived early to events he was hosting. It was one of his rituals, arriving before anyone else, so that he could stand in the empty room and feel it belonged to him before it filled with other people. He needed that this morning more than he had ever needed it. His driver let him out at the hotel's main entrance. The event was in the ballroom on the 3rd floor, a space that held 400 people and that Jonathan had used twice before for investor presentations. Both times had been triumphs. He could still feel the specific energy of those rooms, the forward lean of people who were excited to give him their money, the particular warmth of a crowd that believes in you. He took the elevator to the 3rd floor alone. The doors opened, and Marcus Webb was standing in the corridor waiting for him, which was the first sign that the morning was not going to follow the script. Webb was not a man who stood in corridors waiting for clients before 9 a.m. without a reason. Jonathan stopped. "What happened?" he said. Not a question, a statement. Webb said, "Come inside." They went into the pre-function room adjacent to the ballroom, and Webb closed the door, and Jonathan looked at his attorney's face and felt the cold move through him before any words were spoken. "Rachel Morgan filed an emergency motion at 7 this morning," Webb said. "She's requesting permission to present evidence to attendees of this event under a public interest provision, given that several employees who are victims of the alleged fraud are registered to attend." Jonathan stared at him. "Can she do that?" he said. "She filed it as a motion," Webb said, "which means she's not waiting for approval, she's filing to create a record. Whatever happens today, she wants it documented that she gave notice." "That's not an answer to my question." "The answer to your question," Webb said, "is that I have spent the last 40 minutes on the phone with 2 judges and a clerk. And the short version is that we cannot legally prevent Claire Whitmore from attending a public event as a registered guest, and we cannot prevent her from speaking to individuals in that room in her capacity as a party to an ongoing legal proceeding that directly involves the company this event is promoting." Jonathan said, "She's 8 months pregnant." Webb looked at him. Yes. She wouldn't actually. Jonathan, Webb said, and his voice was patient in the way that running out of patience sounds when it's being carefully managed. She filed those divorce papers. She filed the fraud complaint. She drove the forensic investigation. She is the reason Gerald Hale is cooperating with investigators. He paused. Why would she not come today? Jonathan had no answer for that, because Webb was right. Everything Jonathan had told himself Claire wouldn't do, she had done. Every line he had been certain she wouldn't cross, she had crossed not dramatically, not out of anger, but with the same methodical, unhurried precision that had characterized every move she had made since that plain white envelope landed on his desk. He had said she wouldn't file. She filed. He had said she couldn't have organized documents like that alone. She had organized them better than he organized his own. He had said she wouldn't go to the press. The Tribune had run 2 stories. He stood in the pre-function room and looked at Marcus Webb and said very quietly, "What do I do?" And Webb said something Jonathan had never heard from an attorney in his entire professional life. He said, "I don't know." By 8:15, people had begun arriving. Jonathan stood near the entrance of the ballroom with a practiced ease that was entirely performance, shaking hands, making eye contact, deploying the warm, specific attention that had always been his greatest social gift, the ability to make each person feel in the 30 seconds he spent with them that they were the person he had most been hoping to see. It was a skill he had honed over 20 years, and it had never failed him. It was failing him now. He could see it in the slight hesitations before hands were extended, the half-second too long before eye contact was made, the careful, calibrated warmth of people who had read the Tribune and had questions they weren't yet asking, but were absolutely going to ask. 3 separate investors who had confirmed attendance 2 weeks ago had sent regrets in the past 8 days. The ones who were here were the ones who had too much already invested to stay away, and Jonathan knew the difference between a room that believed in you and a room that was waiting to see which way things fell. This was the second kind of room. He was shaking hands with a commercial developer from the North Shore when he saw Rachel Morgan come through the main doors. She was wearing a dark blazer and carrying a leather briefcase, and she moved through the lobby with the brisk, purposeful stride of someone who was exactly where they intended to be. Behind her was Karen Yu. And behind, Karen was a man. Jonathan didn't recognize late 40s suit, the specific bearing of someone who worked in law enforcement or had recently. Jonathan's hand went still in the middle of the handshake. The developer said, "You all right?" "Fine," Jonathan said automatically. "Excuse me." He crossed the lobby to Webb, who had seen them come in and was already moving. "Who's the man with them?" Jonathan said. "I don't know," Webb said, and he was already pulling out his phone texting someone. His reply came back in 45 seconds. He read it. Then he looked at Jonathan with an expression that contained for the first time something that was not calculation, but something closer to genuine alarm. "His name is Paul Garrett," Webb said. "He's a senior investigator with the state attorney's financial crimes unit." The room tilted slightly. Not literally. But Jonathan felt it, the specific physical sensation of something shifting beneath him, the ground of his certainty, giving way in a way that he had been feeling in increments for 2 weeks, but that now, standing in the lobby of the hotel where he had planned his comeback, felt sudden and total and real. "He's here officially," Jonathan said. "I don't know yet," Webb said. "He could be here as an observer. He could be here because someone invited him. He could be—" Webb stopped. His phone buzzed again. He read the message. His jaw tightened. "What?" Jonathan said. Webb said, "3 former employees just arrived. All 3 are registered as guests." A pause. "All 3 are participants in the profit-sharing plan." Jonathan looked across the lobby. He saw them before Webb pointed them out, a man in his 50s in a jacket that didn't quite fit the event's formality, but was clearly his best, and a woman around the same age and a younger man who Jonathan recognized as a site supervisor from the Lakeview project, a man named Eddie Torres, who had worked for the company for 6 years and who Jonathan had praised by name at a company dinner 2 years ago as an example of the kind of loyalty that made the company great. Eddie Torres was looking across the lobby at Jonathan. He didn't look away when Jonathan met his eyes. That eye contact lasted 3 seconds. It lasted the way eye contact lasts when someone has spent a long time waiting for it and is not going to be the one to break it. Jonathan looked away first. He turned to Webb. "I need to know right now, can we start the program early, reduce the informal period, get people seated, control the flow? Webb said. "We can try. But Jonathan, get Davis. Tell him to move the program up by 20 minutes. I want everyone seated by 8:50. Webb looked at him for a moment. Then he went to find Davis. Jonathan turned back to the room. His mind was moving fast now, running contingencies, which was where he was most comfortable in motion, in problem-solving mode, generating options faster than the situation could eliminate them. It was how he had survived every business crisis of his career. Movement, options, forward. I was halfway across the lobby when the main doors opened again, and Claire walked in. She wore something simple, dark, and she moved the way she always moved, without announcement, without theater. But the room noticed her, the way rooms notice things that they haven't been prepared for. She was 8 months pregnant, and she was carrying a leather folder under one arm, and she was walking beside a woman Jonathan had never seen before, mid-30s, with the specific posture of someone used to walking into rooms where they weren't expected. Jonathan stopped moving. Amy was behind Claire, one step back and to the left, the way she always positioned herself around her sister, close enough to be there, far enough to give Claire the space to be herself. Claire did not look for Jonathan immediately. She looked at the room, she looked at the employees, she looked at Eddie Torres, and Eddie Torres looked at her, and something passed between them. Not words, not gesture, just acknowledgement. The acknowledgement of two people who had independently arrived at the same conclusion about the same man. Then she looked at Jonathan. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She met his eyes across the lobby the way she had met everything for the past 3 months, steadily, without drama, with the particular calm of someone who has already done the hardest part. Jonathan stood absolutely still. And then Davis was at his elbow, saying the program was moved up. Guests were being guided toward the ballroom. Everything was on schedule, and the machinery of the event caught Jonathan and pulled him forward before he could do anything he hadn't planned. He went to the stage. He stood at the podium. He looked out at 340 people, investors, partners, employees, reporters from 2 business publications, and he felt the room, the way he always felt. Rooms reading its energy, calibrating his approach. He found his opening line and he said it, and the room responded the way rooms respond to confident men at podiums, with attention and the subtle forward lean of people preparing to believe what they're about to be told. I was 2 minutes into the speech when he saw Claire take a seat in the 4th row. She opened the leather folder on her lap, and the first crack appeared in Jonathan's voice. It was small, a fraction of a second's hesitation between 2 words that no one who didn't know him would have caught. But Webb, standing at the back of the room, caught it, and Rachel Morgan, sitting 2 seats from Claire, caught it, and Davis, off to the side of the stage, caught it and felt something cold move through his chest. Jonathan pushed on. He got through the company overview. He got through the asset summary, the projected growth figures, the 2 new development projects that were still technically active despite the investigation, because the investigation had not yet resulted in any formal charges. He was good at this. This was where his particular talent lived, in the live performance of certainty, and the room was responding, was recalibrating, was beginning to remember why they had believed in Jonathan Whitmore in the first place. And then he reached the paragraph about the investigation. He had rehearsed this paragraph 40 times. He said, "As many of you are aware, the company is currently the subject of a preliminary inquiry by the state attorney's office. This inquiry stems from allegations made in the context of a difficult personal situation, and I want you to hear directly from me that I am fully cooperating with investigators, that the company's core financials are sound, and that this proceeding will demonstrate, Mr. Whitmore." The voice came from the 4th row, Claire's voice, clear, unhurried, without a microphone, and yet somehow reaching every corner of the room, the way voices do when a room goes completely silent to make space for them. Jonathan stopped. 340 people turned. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Claire said, and she stood carefully, the way a woman at 8 months stands, one hand on the chair back for balance, and she was not performing. She was not acting the dramatic moment. She was just standing up the way she had stood up her entire life when something needed to be said, and she was the one who understood it well enough to say it. "My name is Claire Whitmore," she said. "I am the co-founder of this company, and I need to offer some additional context to what you've just heard." The room was completely still. Jonathan's hands gripped the podium. He said Claire, and his voice, for the first time in his professional life, did not obey him. It came out wrong, too tight, too small, without the smooth authority that had always been his most reliable instrument. Someone in the back of the room, A reporter, as it happened, was already typing. Rachel stood. She said clearly and formally, "Mrs. Whitmore is a named co-founder of Whitmore Construction, LLC, a fact documented in the company's original articles of incorporation, and she has the legal right to address parties with financial interests in the company." Webb from the back said, "This is highly irregular." And then Eddie Torres stood up. Not to speak, just to stand. He stood up in his jacket that didn't quite fit, and he crossed his arms over his chest, and he looked at the stage. And then the woman beside him stood, and then the other former employee. 3 people standing in a room of 340, and the room felt the weight of what that standing meant, and the silence shifted from the silence of a presentation to the silence of something else entirely. The silence of people who are about to hear something they should have been told a long time ago. Claire looked at the room. She did not look at Jonathan. She said, "I helped build this company from bankruptcy. I rebuilt its financial systems. I reviewed its contracts. I protected it from 3 separate deals that would have resulted in catastrophic losses. My signature appears on the original articles of incorporation as co-founder. And over the past 4 years, decisions were made with company assets. Decisions that I did not authorize and was not consulted about, that I believe you deserve to understand before you make any further investment choices." She opened the leather folder. She said, "The profit-sharing plan that was presented to this company's employees 2 years ago, which many of the people in this room helped fund through their own contributions, was used as a source of capital for personal expenditures unrelated to the company's operations. The documentation for this has been provided to the State Attorney's Financial Crimes Unit and is part of an active investigation." She paused. "Some of those employees are here today." She looked at Eddie Torres. Eddie Torres nodded once. A sound moved through the room. Not loud, not a gasp or a reaction. Just a collective shift in breath, the sound a room makes when it fully absorbs something it cannot unabsorb. Jonathan said, "These are allegations. They are documented facts," Claire said, and her voice was still completely calm, and that calmness was somehow more devastating than anger would have been. "The documentation is available. Karen Yu, who conducted the forensic accounting, is in this room and has been working with state investigators for 3 weeks. She paused. "I am not here to embarrass anyone. I'm here because the people in this room deserve accurate information and because the employees of this company deserve to know that someone is fighting for what was taken from them." She closed the folder. She looked at the room for one more moment. Then she sat down. And the room, 340 people, reporters, investors, partners, employees, a senior investigator from the state attorney's office, sat with what she had said in the absolute ringing quiet that follows a truth spoken plainly in a place where lies have been living. Jonathan stood at the podium. He had the speech in front of him. 40 rehearsals, the best narrative money could structure, Davis and Webb, and 3 days of careful language. He couldn't remember a single word of it. He stood at the podium, and he looked at 340 people looking back at him, and he understood with the total clarity that only certain moments in a life can produce that the story he had been telling for 6 years was over. Not because Claire had destroyed it, because she had simply stood up and told the true one. He stepped back from the podium. He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that wouldn't make it worse. He stepped back, and the movement said everything said it to Webb and Davis and every investor in the room, and Webb was already moving toward the side exit, and Davis was already on his phone, and the reporters in the back were already typing with both hands. Jonathan walked off the stage. He walked through the side corridor and through a door and into a service hallway, and he stopped there. He stood in the empty hallway. Somewhere above him, through the walls and the ceiling, he could hear the room beginning to move. Voices, chairs, the specific acoustic texture of a large group of people all deciding simultaneously what to do next. He stood in the hallway for a long time. I thought about tab 11, the co-founder paragraph that Richard Calloway had chosen not to mention on the day the papers arrived. He thought about what it would have meant if he had known then immediately what he was actually dealing with, whether anything would have been different. He didn't think it would have been, because the thing that had brought him here was not a single decision or a single piece of information. It was 6 years of decisions, each one small enough to justify individually, each one built on the foundation of a belief that Claire was manageable, that her silence was compliance, that the woman who had built everything he had was too invested in what they had built to ever turn it against him. He had been wrong about all of it. Not because Claire had changed, because he had never really known what she was. Inside the ballroom, Rachel was speaking quietly with Paul Garrett, the state investigator. Their conversation lasted 4 minutes. Garrett made 2 calls. On the second call, he spoke for 30 seconds, then ended it, and looked at Rachel with the specific expression of someone who has just received a green light. Karen Yu was distributing a 1-page summary document to 3 board members who had approached her immediately after Claire sat down. The document was a condensed version of the forensic findings, figures, dates, account numbers, the kind of thing that made board members' faces go pale in exactly the way these 3 board members' faces were going pale. Eddie Torres was standing with the other 2 former employees and a woman who had introduced herself as a journalist from the Tribune and who was speaking to them in the careful, respectful tone of a reporter who understands that the people she's talking to are not sources. They are people, and that matters. Amy was next to Claire, one hand on her sister's back. "You okay?" Amy said quietly. Claire nodded. She was breathing carefully, slowly, deliberately, the way her doctor had shown her. "I'm okay," she said. "Was it what you thought it would feel like?" Claire thought about that honestly. "No," she said. "I thought it would feel like winning something. It doesn't feel like that." "What does it feel like?" Claire put her hand on her stomach. Her daughter moved that long, rolling motion that had become familiar over the past month, the movement that always made Claire think person. Whole person in there already. "Like setting something down," Claire said. "Something I've been carrying for a long time." Amy squeezed her shoulder. Rachel came back to them 10 minutes later, and her face had the contained professional energy of someone in whom everything is running very fast beneath a very calm surface. "Garrett is filing for a formal preservation order on all company financial records as of close of business today," Rachel said quietly. "The board has requested an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning. 2 board members have already indicated they'll be voting to suspend Jonathan from operational authority pending the investigation." Claire listened to all of this. Then she said, "What about Marcus Webb?" Rachel said, "Webb withdrew from the representation by phone about 8 minutes ago. His assistant called mine." A brief pause. "Jonathan is currently unrepresented." The 3 women sat with that for a moment. Then Amy said, "Who withdraws by phone?" "Someone who wants it on record that they withdrew quickly," Rachel said dryly. And despite everything, despite the weight of the morning, despite the 8 months of exhaustion and fear and meticulous grinding work that had brought them to this hotel ballroom, Claire laughed. It was a short laugh. Surprised real, the kind that comes out of you before you can organize it. Amy started laughing too, and Rachel for exactly 3 seconds allowed herself to join them before composing her expression back into its professional arrangement. It lasted only a moment, but it was real. And in a morning that had been heavy with the specific gravity of truth-telling, it was also necessary. Jonathan's phone had 37 missed calls by the time he retrieved it from the service hallway. He did not return any of them. He called one person, his brother in Milwaukee, the one he hadn't spoken to in 8 months over the financial dispute. He called him because his brother was the only person he could think of who had known him long enough to remember who he was before the company, before the money, before the version of himself he had spent 20 years constructing. His brother answered on the first ring. Jonathan said, "I need to talk to someone." His brother said, "I know. I saw the Tribune this morning." A pause. "Where are you?" Jonathan told him. His brother said, "Stay there, I'm coming." And Jonathan Whitmore, standing in a service hallway in a hotel in downtown Chicago, 42 years old, the man whose empire had just begun to be audited publicly in real time, in a ballroom 2 corridors away, said okay, and his voice finally, for the first time in as long as he could remember, sounded exactly like what it was, the voice of a man who had run out of the ability to make himself sound like anything other than what he actually was. Tired, scared, and completely devastatingly alone. At noon, Rachel drove Claire back to Amy's house. They sat in the car for a moment outside before going in. Rachel said, "You know, this is just the beginning of the legal process. Today was significant, but the investigation will take months. The divorce settlement will take months. There will be difficult days ahead." "I know," Claire said. "The custody question will still have to be resolved." "I know," Claire said again. Rachel looked at her. "How are you?" Claire looked out the window. The street outside Amy's house was quiet, ordinary, the kind of street that has no idea what kind of morning the people driving down it have just lived through. "I keep thinking about something my father used to say," Claire said. "He used to say that when you find a problem in the numbers, the hardest part isn't fixing it. The hardest part is being willing to look at what the numbers actually say instead of what you wanted them to say." Rachel waited. "I've been looking at the numbers for a long time," Claire said. "I just had to be brave enough to let other people see them too." She put her hand on the car door. "The rest of it," she said, "we figure out as we go." She got out of the car. She walked toward the house where her sister was already opening the front door. Behind her in the city, the morning continued to unfold. Board meetings, phone calls, preservation orders, a reporter finishing a story, a senior investigator reviewing documentation, 47 former employees whose profit-sharing accounts were for the first time in 2 years about to receive the attention they deserved. And somewhere in all of that, a man who had once laughed at an envelope stood in a service hallway and waited for his brother. The empire was not finished falling, but it had started. And the woman who had built it, and whose name had always been on the foundation, even when no one was allowed to say so, had made sure that when it fell, the truth fell with it. Claire's daughter was born on a Thursday morning 3 weeks after the investor event in a room at Northwestern Memorial Hospital that smelled like antiseptic and fresh air from a window someone had cracked open because Claire had asked for it. Amy was there. Rachel had come and gone twice, once in the early hours when things were moving slowly, and once closer to the end when things were moving fast. The doctor was a woman Claire had chosen 8 months ago for 2 specific reasons. She was thorough, and she did not talk down to her patients. Jonathan was not there. Claire had not called him. She had thought about it in the hours before dawn, when the contractions were still far enough apart that her mind had space to wander, and she had let herself think about it honestly. Not the version of the thought where she was angry, and not the version where she was sad, but the actual thought examined plainly the way her father had taught her to examine things. She decided that calling him would have been about her own discomfort with the silence, not about what her daughter needed. Her daughter needed to be born into a room full of people who were fully uncomplicated present. That was Amy. That was her doctor. That was the nurse named Patricia, who held Claire's hand during the hardest 20 minutes and told her she was doing well in a voice that was matter-of-fact rather than performed, which was exactly the right thing. At 7:42 in the morning, Eleanor Bennett Whitmore came into the world. She weighed 7 pounds and 4 ounces. She had Claire's nose, and as Amy immediately pointed out, while crying in a way she would later deny, their father's forehead. Claire held her daughter and felt something she did not have adequate words for then, and was not sure she would ever fully have adequate words for a specific gravity, a settling as if everything that had been in motion for months had found its center. Eleanor was warm and solid and entirely real, and she looked at Claire with the unfocused gaze of someone who has just arrived somewhere and is still taking stock, and Claire thought, I would do all of it again. Every document, every night, every hard thing. I would do all of it again for this. She called Eleanor by her full name in her head for exactly 1 day. After that, she called her Ellie. Jonathan found out his daughter had been born from a formal legal notification that Rachel's office sent to his temporary attorney. He was on his 3rd attorney in 6 weeks the following morning. The notification included Eleanor's full name, birth date, weight, and the hospital where she had been delivered. It was legally complete and emotionally hollow, which was Rachel's precise intention. Jonathan's temporary attorney forwarded it to him with a brief note. Jonathan read it twice. He sat with it for a long time. Then he called his brother in Milwaukee, the same brother who had driven down the morning of the investor event, and sat with him in a hotel coffee shop for 3 hours, while the legal machinery around them accelerated. His brother had become in the weeks since the only person Jonathan consistently talked to. Not because they had resolved the 8 months of distance between them, they hadn't, not fully, but because his brother was the only person left in Jonathan's life who spoke to him like a human being rather than a liability. She had the baby, Jonathan said. His brother said, I know. Amy texted me. Jonathan said, Amy texted you. Amy and I have been in contact, his brother said without apology. She wanted someone to keep me updated in case you needed to know how things were going. A pause. Baby's healthy. Claire's healthy. Jonathan closed his eyes. Eleanor, he said. They named her Eleanor. His brother was quiet for a moment. That's a good name. It was her grandmother's name, Jonathan said. Claire's grandmother. She talked about it once early on. I forgot I knew that until just now. His brother said, Jonathan. I know, Jonathan said. Whatever you're feeling right now, his brother said carefully. You need to feel it separately from the legal strategy. Webb, or whoever you have now, cannot be part of this conversation. This is just you figuring out what you actually want your relationship with your daughter to look like. Because that part, whatever happens with everything else, that part is going to matter for the rest of your life. Jonathan had no answer for that. But for the first time in a conversation about this situation, he didn't deflect. He didn't reach for a strategy or a counterposition. He just sat with the question the way his brother intended, as an actual question about an actual future, requiring an actual honest answer. He didn't have the answer yet, but he was for the first time actually looking for it. The board of Whitmore Construction voted to suspend Jonathan from all operational authority 17 days after the investor event. The vote was 4-1. The single dissenting vote was a board member who had invested in the company's earliest days and who had, according to Rachel's contact on the board, made a speech before the vote about loyalty and due process that lasted 11 minutes and convinced no one. The suspension was not a firing. Not yet. Legally, with the investigation ongoing and the divorce proceeding active, the board was navigating careful ground, but the practical effect was total. Jonathan had no access to company accounts, no authority over contracts, no ability to make operational decisions. His keycard was deactivated. His email access was suspended. Derek, who had come back to work after his personal days and had quietly become one of Karen Yu's most cooperative internal sources, had been moved into a temporary administrative role, working directly with the board. The company continued operating without Jonathan. It operated because the systems that ran it, the financial architecture, the reporting structures, the vendor payment processes, the internal audit protocols had all been built by Claire 6 years ago and had continued running because good systems properly constructed do not require their builder to be present. They simply run. When Karen Yu pointed this out in a meeting with the board, one board member said, "We should have been paying her a long time ago." Karen said, "You should have been paying her a lot of things a long time ago." The board member did not argue. The fraud investigation moved faster than anyone anticipated, which was partly due to Gerald Hale's cooperation, partly due to the documentation Karen Yu had assembled, and partly due to the fact that Paul Garrett was the kind of investigator who treated organized evidence the way a carpenter treats a well-cut piece of wood, with professional appreciation and efficient use. By the time Ellie was 6 weeks old, the state attorney's office had issued formal charges. Fraud. Financial misconduct, misappropriation of employee funds, 3 counts each carrying significant potential consequences. Jonathan's attorney, the third one, entered a not guilty plea. But the attorney also, in a private communication to Rachel Morgan that Rachel shared with Claire at Amy's kitchen table one Tuesday afternoon, indicated that his client was open to discussing a resolution that avoided a full criminal trial in exchange for restitution and cooperation. Claire read that communication and looked at Rachel. "He wants to deal," Claire said. "He needs to deal," Rachel said. "The evidence is strong enough that a trial carries enormous risk for him. His attorney knows it." "What about the employees?" Claire said. "The profit-sharing funds." "Full restitution of all diverted funds is a non-negotiable condition of any deal we discuss," Rachel said. "Karen has the exact figures. Every employee who contributed to that plan gets back what they put in, plus interest." Claire said, "And the co-founder's stake." Rachel said, "That is the centerpiece of the divorce settlement. His attorney has already acknowledged it can't be contested. The documentation is too clean." She paused. "Claire, you are in a position to negotiate from a place of genuine legal strength right now. You can ask for what is actually fair and have reasonable expectation of getting it." Claire looked at the coffee mug in her hands. Ellie was asleep in the next room, making the small, specific sounds that Ellie made when she was sleeping deeply and undisturbed, a faint, rhythmic breathing that Claire had memorized over 6 weeks the way you memorize music that means something to you. She thought about what fair looked like. Not revenge, not maximum extraction. Fair. She said, "I want the employees made whole first, before anything related to my settlement. I want it structured so that their restitution is not contingent on the other negotiation outcomes." Rachel said, "I can make that a condition." "I want a custody arrangement that puts Ellie's stability first," Claire said. "Not my convenience and not his punishment. What's actually best for her." Rachel nodded. "And I want," Claire said, and she paused, finding the words carefully, I want the company, not to run him out, not as revenge. But I built those systems. My name was on the founding documents. I know that business better than anyone alive, and the employees deserve leadership that isn't going to steal from them." She looked at Rachel. "I want operational authority restored contingent on the settlement. I'll work with the board, but I want it." Rachel looked at her for a long moment. "That's going to be the hardest ask," she said. "I know," Claire said. "He'll fight it. He'll lose it," Claire said. "You said the evidence is strong enough. His attorney wants to deal. A man facing fraud charges does not have the leverage to deny the co-founder her role in the company she co-founded." Rachel was quiet. Then she said, "You know, when you first came to my office 7 months ago, I thought this woman knows exactly what she wants. I just wasn't sure yet if she had the stomach for how hard it was going to be to get it." Claire said, "And now?" Rachel picked up her pen. "Now," she said, "I'm going to go get you exactly what you asked for." The negotiation took 11 weeks. 11 weeks of careful grinding back-and-forth legal work that Rachel later described as the most complex, simultaneous proceeding she had ever managed because it involved a criminal matter, a civil divorce settlement, a corporate governance restructuring, and a custody arrangement, all happening in overlapping timeframes with overlapping legal teams. There were days when Claire received 3 calls from Rachel before noon. There were days when the other side went quiet in ways that were either strategic or desperate, and were sometimes both. Jonathan's responses to the negotiation were, according to Rachel, consistent with a man who was slowly and painfully accepting the gap between what he wanted and what he had. He pushed back on the operational authority question for 6 weeks before his attorney finally explained to him directly that a man under active fraud charges had no realistic path to blocking a legal co-founder from exercising her rights in a company his criminal conduct had damaged. He agreed to the employee restitution condition in the 3rd week. That agreement came quickly, and Rachel thought she understood why, because it was the one part of this that Jonathan, somewhere in whatever remained of his capacity for honest self-reckoning, knew was simply right. Those workers had trusted him. The money was theirs. He agreed to it without the usual procedural delays. That small thing did not redeem him. It was not meant to. But Claire noted it because she was someone who noted things accurately without adding meaning that wasn't there and without subtracting meaning that was. The custody arrangement was the most careful work of all, and it was the part that Claire spent the most time thinking about, not because she was afraid of the outcome, but because it was the part that was actually about Ellie, and Ellie deserved the same quality of attention that Claire brought to everything. She had a conversation with Amy about it on a Sunday afternoon when Ellie was 10 weeks old and had recently discovered that she could make a specific sound that was approximately a vowel, which she was deploying with great frequency and obvious satisfaction. "Do you want him to be in her life?" Amy asked. Claire thought about the question without rushing it. "I want her to know who her father is," she said. "Not the version he performed for the world, the actual person, all of it." She paused. "Because she's going to have questions as she gets older, and I want her to be able to find the answers for herself without me having made those answers impossible to find." Amy said, "That's a generous position given everything." "It's not generous," Claire said. "It's accurate. He did terrible things. He also loved her in whatever way he was capable of loving something he hadn't yet used for his own advantage. She's going to have to reconcile both of those things when she's old enough to understand them." She looked down at Ellie, who was working very hard on her vowel sounds. "I don't want to make that reconciliation harder by cutting the first part out entirely." Amy was quiet. "Dad would say something wise right now," Amy said. "Dad would say check the documentation twice and make sure the custody schedule is in writing," Claire said. And Amy laughed and Claire laughed, and Ellie, perhaps encouraged by the sound, produced her best vowel yet. The settlement was signed on a Wednesday morning 11 weeks after the negotiation began. Jonathan signed first in a conference room at his attorney's office. He did not ask for a pen. He had brought one, which Rachel later thought said something about him that she couldn't quite articulate. He signed each page without speaking. When he was done, he looked at the document for a moment. He said to his attorney, "Is she going to be okay?" His attorney said, "Claire." Jonathan said, "Yes." His attorney said carefully, "I believe so." Jonathan nodded. He picked up his pen. He put it in his pocket. He left. Claire signed 30 minutes later in Rachel's office with Amy beside her and Ellie in the car seat on the floor making sounds at the ceiling. Rachel went through each page. Claire read every word because she always read every word, and Rachel had stopped being surprised by this and had started building extra time into their meetings to accommodate it. When they reached the final page, Claire signed her name in the same careful, clear handwriting that had appeared on every document she had ever produced. Claire Bennett Whitmore. Not just his wife, not just his co-founder, not the woman he had tried to make disappear. Just herself, fully, legally, completely herself. When it was done, Rachel said, "It's over." Claire looked up. "The marriage is over," she said. "The rest of it is just beginning." What happened in the months that followed was, by every external measure, exactly what the law and the settlement had ordered. Jonathan faced the fraud charges in a proceeding that resulted in a plea agreement, 18 months of supervised release, substantial fines, the restitution payments to employees that he had agreed to early, and a permanent prohibition from serving as an officer or director of any publicly traded company. He did not go to prison. Whether that outcome was just or merely legal was a question that people argued about, and that Claire declined to join because arguing about Jonathan's consequences was not how she intended to spend her future. He moved to Milwaukee to be near his brother. Claire heard this from Amy, who heard it from Amy's contact in that direction, and she noted it the way she noted things factually, without editorial, and moved on. The company restructuring took 4 months. Claire worked with the board and with Derek, who turned out to be exactly the kind of detail-oriented, quietly competent person that Claire had always been drawn to in professional contexts, meaning they got along immediately and efficiently. The financial systems she had built 6 years ago were intact. The processes worked. Several of the subsidiary structures that Jonathan had created for questionable purposes were dissolved, and the company came out of the restructuring smaller but cleaner, which was how Claire had always believed good companies should be built not as large as possible, but as sound as possible. The employees received their restitution payments in full, with interest over 2 disbursements. The day the first disbursement went out, Derek sent Claire a text message that said simply, "Eddie Torres just called the office. He said to tell you thank you." Claire read that text 3 times. She did not have an adequate response, so she sent a single word back. Good. Eddie Torres did not know that Claire had read the company profit-sharing plan documents on the night she first discovered the restaurant charge, had understood immediately that the people most at risk from Jonathan's conduct were the workers who had trusted him and had made their restitution the first non-negotiable condition of any resolution. He did not know that Claire had said in Rachel's office, on a night when she was 7 months pregnant and should have been sleeping, that if the employees weren't protected, she didn't want a settlement at all. He just knew the money came back. Sometimes that's the right amount to know. 6 months after the settlement, Claire started the foundation. She did not name it after herself. She named it after her father, whose last name was Bennett, and who had taught her that numbers never lied, and that the most important skill a person could develop was the ability to look at what was actually there, rather than what they wished was there. The Bennett Foundation's stated purpose was direct and specific financial education and legal assistance for women in abusive financial situations. Not just domestic violence situations, though those were included, but the broader category of situations in which a partner, spouse, or family member has used financial control as a mechanism of power, restricting access, forging signatures, manipulating accounts, erasing contributions, making someone economically invisible while appearing to include them. The situations that didn't always look like abuse from the outside, but felt like it from the inside. Claire knew exactly what those situations felt like. She had spent 6 years in one. The Foundation's first program was a hotline. The second was a referral network of attorneys Rachel Morgan helped build it, who offered reduced-fee consultations. The third was a financial literacy curriculum that Claire wrote herself over 3 months of evenings after Ellie was asleep, drawing on everything she knew about financial systems and the specific ways they could be used to harm rather than protect. The curriculum was 40 pages. She had her father's notebooks open on the desk while she wrote it. Rachel called her when the Foundation's nonprofit status was approved. "How does it feel?" Rachel asked. "Like something that should have existed already," Claire said. "Most important things are like that," Rachel said. In the first year, the Bennett Foundation received contact from 237 women. Some of them needed legal help, some needed financial guidance, some needed more than anything else to speak to someone who would believe them without requiring them to prove it first, because the experience of being disbelieved had been part of what had kept them in their situations as long as they had been. Claire did not have conversations with all of them. She couldn't. She was running a restructured construction company, raising a daughter, building a foundation, and she was one person, even a very efficient one. But she read every intake form, every one. Because the woman who had sat alone at a kitchen table at 7 months pregnant and let herself finally feel the things she had been not feeling deserved to know that her story had not ended in that kitchen. It had started there. Ellie turned 1 year old on a Thursday, the same day of the week she had been born. Amy made a cake that was aggressively over-decorated and that Ellie approached with the specific focused intensity she had been showing toward all new experiences since roughly month 4, which was to say, complete seriousness followed by total commitment. She got frosting everywhere. Claire watched her daughter navigate her first birthday cake and felt the specific, uncomplicated joy of a moment that did not require interpretation. No documentation, no context, no history, just her daughter and a cake and the specific quality of afternoon light through Amy's kitchen window. She thought about her father. She thought he would have loved this. She thought he would have found a mathematical principle to apply to the frosting distribution, and he would have been earnest about it, and everyone would have laughed. She thought, I'm going to tell Ellie about him. All of it. The notebooks, the way he explained accounting by comparing it to building a house, the way he said numbers never lie and meant it as a comfort, not a constraint. She was going to give Ellie everything she had, not the edited version, not the version that made her mother look uncomplicated, but the true version. The one that included the fear and the long nights and the restaurant charge found on an ordinary Tuesday, and a woman sitting alone at a kitchen table deciding to stop not feeling the thing she already knew. Because Ellie was going to grow up. And when she grew up, she was going to encounter the world with all the ways the world could try to make a woman feel small or manageable or invisible. And Claire wanted her daughter to know from the very beginning, from the foundation of everything she understood about herself, you are not manageable. You are not invisible. You are the person your mother built a case against a millionaire for. You are the reason the Bennett Foundation exists. You are the child born into a room full of people who were fully uncomplicated present. You were never nothing. You were always the point. Victoria Hale had moved to New York 8 months after the investor event. She did not leave because of the scandal exactly, or not only because of it. She left because Chicago had become a city where every room she walked into had some layer of association with a man she had spent 2 years believing was choosing her and who had turned out to be choosing no one but himself. She did not hate Jonathan. That surprised her. She had expected to hate him, had prepared for it, had almost looked forward to it, because hatred at least had a shape you could organize around. What she actually felt was something harder to name, a kind of emptiness where the story had been. She had built a future in her head that turned out to be constructed entirely of things Jonathan had said, and now that those things had been revealed as performance, the future had disappeared with them. She started over in New York. She did not contact Claire. She had thought about it in the early months, thought about writing a letter or sending something, some acknowledgement of the position she had occupied, in a situation that had hurt someone who hadn't deserved to be hurt. But she could never find the version of that communication that was about Claire, rather than about Victoria's own need to be absolved, and she was honest enough with herself to recognize the difference. She didn't send the letter. She thought about Claire sometimes, though. She thought about the photograph she had seen in the Tribune taken at the investor event, not Claire at the podium, because there was no podium moment, but a photograph taken from somewhere in the room of Claire, standing one hand on the chair back, 8 months pregnant, speaking to a room full of people with the specific calmness of someone who is saying true things and knows they are true. Victoria had looked at that photograph for a long time. She thought, I never understood what I was watching. She thought she was never losing. Not for a single day of those 2 years. She thought, I hope she's okay. She didn't say it to anyone, but she thought it. On a Sunday afternoon, 14 months after the investor event, Claire sat at the desk in her home office, her own home now, a house in Evanston, 2 streets from where she had grown up, which she had found and purchased with the particular satisfaction of someone who has earned the right to choose exactly where they want to be, and she looked at the financial report for the company's 3rd quarter. It was good, not spectacular, not back to the heights of Jonathan's most aggressive growth years, but clean and solid and built on deals that would still look sound in 5 years. The kind of company that didn't make dramatic headlines, the kind that people trusted. She closed the report and opened the Bennett Foundation's intake file for the week. 17 new contacts. She went through each form, slowly noting the circumstances, the specific ways each situation had been structured to keep someone from seeing their own options clearly. She recognized things in those forms, not from Jonathan specifically, but from the logic of it, the particular architecture of a situation, designed to make someone feel that the walls were fixed when they were actually just doors no one had told her she could open. She had been shown the doors. She was spending her life making sure other women could see them too. She closed the foundation file and checked the time. Ellie would be waking from her nap in 20 minutes. Amy was coming for dinner. The third quarter report was done. The foundation intake was reviewed. The day was ordinary in exactly the way she had once been afraid would never be possible for her again. She picked up her father's notebook, the one she kept on her desk, not to read, but to have near the way you keep something near, that grounds you. And she held it for a moment. She had told Ellie about her grandfather's notebooks already, even though Ellie was 14 months old and had understood none of it, and had primarily been interested in whether the notebook was edible, which it was not, but which Ellie had investigated thoroughly. She would tell her again and again, until the words took root. Numbers never lie. Look at what's actually there. Be brave enough to let other people see it too. From the next room, Ellie woke up. Not crying. Ellie rarely woke from naps crying. She woke up making sounds, the vowel sounds she had been developing since week 10, and that had evolved over 14 months into something recognizable as the beginning of language. She woke up talking to herself, which Amy said was a habit she had clearly inherited, and which Claire took as the highest possible compliment. Claire set the notebook down. She stood up. She went to get her daughter. The divorce papers that Jonathan Whitmore had laughed at were filed in a courthouse on a Tuesday morning by a woman who had spent 3 months building the case that changed everything. Those papers had ended a marriage built on the slow erasure of the person who had made it possible. They had begun a legal proceeding that returned stolen money to people who had trusted the wrong man. They had revealed a co-founder the company had always had and had pretended not to. They had introduced the world to a woman who had been managing the numbers all along. Claire did not keep a copy of the divorce papers on her desk. She kept her father's notebook. She kept Ellie's first birthday photograph, the one with frosting on her chin, and the expression of complete triumph. She kept the first intake form from the Bennett Foundation, the first woman who had called on a cold morning in February, who had said, "I don't know if what's happening to me counts," and Claire had said, "Tell me what the numbers look like," and the woman had begun to speak. These were the things that mattered, not the fall, not the moment in the ballroom, not the newspaper photograph or the fraud charges or the boardroom vote. The things that mattered were smaller and truer and longer lasting than any of that. A daughter who would grow up knowing her own worth because her mother had fought to understand hers. A foundation that existed because one woman had refused to let her silence become her legacy. A company that ran on systems built by someone who had never needed her name on the door to know what she had built. And a woman who had once sat alone at a kitchen table 7 months pregnant, finding her daughter's heartbeat in the quiet, and had decided in that moment that silence was no longer the price she was willing to pay for safety. She had been right about that. It had cost her everything she thought she had. It had given her everything she actually needed. That was not a tragedy. That was not even close to a tragedy. That was a woman who looked at what the numbers actually said, found the courage to let the world see them too, and walked away from the rubble of someone else's lies into a life that was finally and completely and without apology entirely her own.